All right, so this lecture, I'm just going to kind of go over when I discovered the quadrant model. So it was my sophomore year of college. I remember I was hanging out with my friend Malcolm. Malcolm was from some sort of South American country. And like I said, I was kind of acting weird at the time because what I would do is everywhere I went, I would carry a notepad and I saw myself as like Socrates. So I would have conversations with people and I would try to make them philosophical, and I would write down my conversations, and it was basically like I was Plato and Socrates at the same time. So I would write down the conversations I myself was having with the other people, and I was trying to make like profound dialogues. But an example of that was like I was walking with Malcolm, and my grandpa had told me about the difference between teaching and preaching. So like my grandpa said that when you preach, my grandpa said preaching is wisdom spoken without understanding, and teaching is giving answers before questions are asked. And so I was talking with Malcolm about, I was walking with Malcolm, and I'm like trying to expound to him my grandpa's teachings, like, the difference between preaching and teaching. And I was writing down our conversations as I had them on my notepad. And like when I'd get home, I would write down the conversations I had, and I was trying to make dialogues, and I was trying to make myself like Socrates. So it was kind of weird. But I ended up discovering the quadrant model around this time. So then like when I was with my friend Brian, who was from Taiwan, I remember I was talking to him. Again, my grandpa taught me a lot of stuff, and if it wasn't for my grandpa, I wouldn't have discovered the quadrant model. So like one thing that my grandpa taught me was he told me the definition of passion is when it's like losing yourself when you're a part of something greater than yourself. You're passionate, being a part of something greater than yourself. So I was telling Brian about this, and as I was talking to him, like I'd be right. After our conversations, I would write down the conversations we had, and I make myself like Socrates, and I'm explaining to people stuff. And another thing that my grandpa taught me, I remember I was talking to my grandpa on the phone, and my grandpa was telling me that thinking and emotion, my grandpa told me, he was like, thinking and emotion are illusions. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he was like, well, when thoughts and emotions are shaped by the ego, by the self. Your thoughts are shaped by your identity and your ego. Well, my grandpa said, but the self is an illusion. So thoughts and emotions are illusions. So I was like, okay. So my grandpa was telling me about that. And then, I had other conversations with my grandpa. Like my grandpa told me one time that the definition of contemplation. So these all come in, are significant when I discovered the quadrant model. So I'll get to that. But at one point, my grandpa told me the definition of contemplation. He was like, when you contemplate, you focus on eternal qualities. So it's like my grandpa was telling me all this stuff. Like I would have a conversation with my grandpa on the phone, and ultimately it all led to me discovering the quadrant model. Let me turn off the air conditioner 1 second. So then like another example was, I remember when I was in high school, I once asked my grandpa, what are we? My grandpa said, we are awareness. So I was like, that's interesting. Like, what does he mean by we are awareness? But then my grandpa would later say that we are energy and, all that. But, but anyways, so then, as I said, my grandpa one day, I was talking to him on the phone. This was like 2 weeks or maybe like a week before I discovered the quadrant model. And my grandpa told me that he had studied a personality model. There's 4 types of people: thinking people, emotional people, doers, and dreamers. And he told me that he thought that I was a dreamer. But I was thinking to myself, why would I be a dreamer? I'm more of a doer because I play basketball, I rap, I do all that stuff. I thought I was more of a doer, and I didn't think of myself as a dreamer. So, but then I was like, but why is there 4 types of people and not 3 types of people? Because I was like, dreaming doesn't seem to fit with the other 3. Like I could see what it means to be a thinking person, emotional person, and a doing person. But I was like, but dreaming person, like a dreamer, that just seems kind of weird. So like I said, I was like trying to figure that theory out that my grandpa told me. And then, like I said, this is, I'm not really reluctant to say this because this, like, it really happened, but it's almost like people will think that I'm making this up, but I'm telling you, the first time I ever read the Bible, I was on the chapter where Jesus was crucified. And to me, that's significant. So I was reading the chapter of Jesus crucified, first time I ever really read the Bible. And then I drew in the Bible a cross, a quadrant, and I put in it, thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. And I was thinking, okay, because earlier that week I had watched a teaching company course that my other grandpa gave me on physics, where they talk about the strong force, the weak force, electromagnetism, and gravity. And he was saying each force is different aspects of one thing. They're different versions of one thing. So he said they're separate, but they're actually interconnected and they're the same. And he was saying that gravity is separate than the other three. It doesn't fit with the other three. So, and I was thinking, okay, well, same thing kind of with thinking, motion, doing, and dreaming. Like dreaming doesn't fit with the other three, like gravity. And I was like, okay, thoughts affect emotions, emotions affect thoughts. So that's like a duality, like kind of like the weak force and the strong force. And I thought, and then doing, that's, you know, we have emotions and that causes us to do things. So I thought, okay, thinking, emotion, doing, that's a trinity. And then, you know, we do things and that affects our thoughts. So I thought, okay, kind of like the guy in that on that physics course said, they're different aspects of the same thing. I was like, they're different versions of the same thing. There's a trinity. They're separate, but they're one. And I thought dreaming, when we dream, we're, you know, earlier that week I was at a psychology class at UC San Diego. And the teacher was saying that when you dream, you're separate from your body, you're paralyzed, but you still do things, but you're paralyzed, so you don't physically do them. So I thought, okay, well, dreaming is separate. Like you do things and you have thoughts and you have emotions, but there's a different quality to them. You don't actually do them, you do it in the dream world. So that it's separate, but it contains the first three. And like I said, this is another example. Like if it wasn't for my grandpa, I wouldn't have discovered the theory of everything, because my grandpa, when I had visited him in Kauai, he had this book by Ken Wilber called The Theory of Everything. And in the book, there was a quadrant model, but it wasn't the same thing that I discovered, but it was where he divided everything into 4 categories, where he said that there's interior objective, interior subjective, exterior objective, and exterior subjective. And he said that all knowledge can be put in those 4 quadrants. But he would talk about holons and stuff, and he would say, you know, each holon transcends but incorporates levels from the previous holons. So I thought, well, that's kind of like thinking, motion, doing, dreaming. Each quadrant transcends the quadrant before it, but also contains it. So like when you dream, you do things, you have thoughts, and you have emotions, but it also transcends them. So it's separate, but it contains the first 3. So that's what I thought. So I had that realization, and the only reason why I could have that realization was because my grandpa had given me that book by Ken Wilber about the quadrant. You know, Ken Wilber in the book had that quadrant in it, and he called it the theory of everything. But I had that realization, okay, the third is separate, but it contains the fourth is separate, but it contains the first 3. So then, as I said, I went to my, right when I discovered it, I knew it that I had discovered the theory of everything. Because like my intuition told me, I was like, this is the way reality has to be. Everything in existence has to fit around this pattern. It was like, it's something that I always knew. And like I said, and this is going to make people like, it's almost like I knew the quadrant model before I discovered the quadrant model, because I remember even when I was in high school and my parents were making me talk to a psychologist, and I went to the psychologist. I remember he was a Jewish guy, but I forget his name, but I was talking to him and he was like, you know, there's so much in the universe and, you know, we're never going to know everything. And I told him, I said, I think that everything is known, but just someone has to put everything together. Like, how would and I remember I said that to him and he was like, that's interesting. But he was just like, oh, well, you know, I think that you know, there's too much to be known and we're never going to know everything. I was like, I think everything's known and someone has to put it all together. And that's what I felt like I did when I discovered the quadrant model. And it was like, right when I discovered it, I just knew it. I was like, my intuition just told me everything in existence has to fit this. So then when I thought about the planets, I'm like, yeah, there's the 4 terrestrial planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. I was just like, I knew it had to be that way. I was just like, it has to be that way because it's a quadrant. And I knew that there had to be one formula behind everything. It was just like an intuition that I just knew had to be so. So when I start, then when I'm, you know, thinking of other examples, they just keep on coming to me. And then I start to study it, you know, after that, for the rest of college, I just nonstop, every day I would go to different classes all day, every day. And I would just study this nonstop. And I was just like, I know that this has to be the way it is. And reality confirmed it, because every class I went to, everything is built around this quadrant pattern. They're bringing up the quadrant pattern in every single class. I see that everything's organized around this thing. And so I was like, yeah. So when I discovered it, like immediately I knew I discovered the theory of everything. And then, like I said, I showed my friend Malcolm, I showed my friend Michael, I showed a bunch of people at UC San Diego. And and then, yeah, so then, like, I'm going through the internet, I'm just studying it nonstop, and like I go through the standard model of particle physics, and I see that there's 16 types, and it's a 4x4 matrix. So I'll get to how the 4x4 matrix is significant. But so the day after I discovered the quadrant model, I went to my biology class. And at the biology class, the professor was talking about the 4 nucleobases and the four elements that make up all life: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And he's talking about this stuff. So again, I'm just like, yeah, I know this has to be so, because it's a quadrant. Everything has to fit around the quadrant. I knew it. My whole life I knew. And like I said, my whole life, my first memory, I'm not making this up. My first memory, I was walking around my preschool and something told me that I was the Messiah. So I was just like, and my whole life, that was always in the back of my head. So it's not like something that happened when I was in college. Like, people say that people become schizophrenic when they're in college and they start to like have delusions and stuff, usually in college. But that's not the case with me, because I remember my whole life I thought that when I was a little tiny kid. I was just walking around and I knew that, and that's what, and it shaped my whole life. That's why I never drank alcohol. That's why I never did a lot of stuff, right? So, but yeah, so basically, I'm in the class and they're talking about the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and all this stuff, and I was just like, yes, it has to be this way, because of the quadrants of I knew it right away. I said the quadrant's a form of being. It's a form of existence. It's what our existence is built around. When I discovered it, I wasn't surprised. I knew my whole life that I was going to do this. But, obviously I didn't know exactly that I was going to discover the quadrant model, but I knew that I was going to do something huge like this. So then so then I went to the bathroom. So when I was in my biology class, and I went to the bathroom, and this was like right before finals, and I drew a quadrant, and I wrote in the quadrant, thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. And then I drew under that quadrant another quadrant. I wrote in it, contemplation, passion, flowing, knowing. Now again, if it wasn't for my grandpa, I wouldn't have discovered this, because I thought to myself, okay, thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. As my grandpa said, there is no thoughts, emotions, doing, dreaming, because that's all shaped around the ego. So I thought, okay, so I drew those, and I wrote on the top of it, interpersonal, ego, interpersonal, rational consciousness, thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. So that's consciousness that's oriented around the ego, the self, the body. So that's the third quadrant. That's going to be significant, because the third quadrant is always connected to the body, right? And then I wrote below it, contemplation, passion, flowing, knowing. And I wrote transpersonal, transrational. Because I knew that, and that's the fourth quadrant, because that's the transcendence of the body. That's the transcendence of the self. Once you transcend the self, that's when you contemplate. And as my grandpa said, when you contemplate, you're focusing on eternal qualities. So, turn down a little bit because I can hear it a little bit. But so contemplation, passion, flowing, knowing, that's a transpersonal, transrational. And like I said, my grandpa had told me about the 4 types of consciousness, where he said the first level is instinctual, the second level is magical, religious, the third level is interpersonal, rational, and the fourth level is transpersonal, transrational. So again, if it wasn't for my grandpa, I wouldn't have discovered this. But now people are going to think, well, maybe your grandpa planted the seeds, and maybe your grandpa was really the one. No, my grandpa didn't believe the quadrant model when I showed it to him, so I'll get to that. So then then I drew a third quadrant, and I drew the first quadrant, and I wrote sensation, perception, response, awareness. And that was the instinctual level of consciousness that my grandpa told me about. So sensation, perception, that's a duality. There's always a duality, like thinking, emotion, or contemplation, passion. And this time it was sensation, perception. They're separate, but they're connected. And then response, you have sensations, you have perceptions, and then there's automatic responses. So this is the instinctual level of consciousness. And I wrote in the fourth quadrant, awareness. And I thought awareness is separate, because remember, my grandpa told me in high school that he thought that everything is awareness. So I was like, okay, awareness is separate, but it contains the first 3. And then later that week, so this is where it gets weird. Like I said, I had started seeing everything in reality as like a dream. And now people might say that it's very possible that I was going schizophrenic, because maybe all the trauma that I had gone through, I don't know why it was, but at the time I was. So this is interesting. Like, I was following signs. So at this point, and I'm going to try to psychoanalyze this, where at that point, I was following, like if I saw someone wearing red and blue, if I saw like someone wearing red and someone wearing blue and they were going the same way, I would follow them. Because I would see like the red and the blue as contrasting, but coming together of dualities. So I was like, I saw reality as like a dream, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna make a contract with reality where I'm gonna tell reality to like put these contrasting colors together, and I will follow them. So so the idea was, I'm not gonna decide where I'm gonna go. I'm gonna let the signs tell me where to go. So I would see someone wearing yellow and red and green, and they're walking together. I would be like, okay, that's a sign I should follow them. So I would start following them. And I just started like doing that throughout the whole day. Because now people say that that's like schizotypal, where you're trying to see like signs in reality and stuff like that. But another idea was, like, my grandpa said, when you're in the flow, it's not you doing it. You lose yourself. And so, even later I would ask my grandpa about, there's this ritual that the Hindus would do where they would set a horse loose, and they would follow the horse, and wherever the horse went, they would conquer that territory. And so it's like, it's not them deciding what territory is going to conquer, it's the horse. So it's them letting go of control. Like they're not the one deciding, it's the horse. So they're like thinking that God's so that's the idea of letting go of this self. So I was trying to be in the flow where I don't want to make decisions. I'm letting the universe make decisions for me. And like another example would be like, I would follow people who are wearing checkers, because I discovered the quadrant model. So if I saw someone wearing like a plaid shirt, I would start to follow him, and I would let him take me somewhere. And then I would try to, because in my mind, I just discovered the quadrant model, and then I would start having conversations with people. And I thought that the universe would guide me to more realizations and revelations. So at this day, I was deciding to follow the pattern. So I was just like, that's what I did the whole day. So I was just like following people. Like I said, I just quit basketball, so I had all day to do whatever I wanted. So I was just like following people who were wearing certain colors, or following people who were wearing like, checkers and stuff. And then I bumped into this girl who played on like the volleyball team. And then I started to talk to her. But then like right when I was talking to her, then I had the revelation of the second quadrant, because I've been trying to think about the second quadrant, what I should do. So I put in it belief, faith, behavior, belonging. So the duality is belief and faith, and then our beliefs affect our faith affects our beliefs, and then our faith affects our behaviors. So belief, faith, behavior, and then belonging. So, and if you have the right belief in faith and behaviors, then you belong. And that's like, belonging is a desire. It's desire. Longing means a desire, and like belonging is elemental to reality. So then I thought, okay, so belief, faith, behavior, belonging. So awareness, there's sensation, perception, response, awareness. That's the first quadrant. And awareness points to belief, faith, behavior, belonging, because we have a lot of awareness. We have awareness of so many things, and then we consolidate our awareness into beliefs, which is the second quadrant. So the fourth quadrant, so awareness is the fourth quadrant of the first quadrant, or the fourth square of the first quadrant. And then belief is the first square of the second quadrant. So our awareness gets consolidated into beliefs. The fourth quadrant always points to the fifth quadrant. The fourth quadrant contains everything before it, but then it points to what comes after it, the fifth quadrant. So there's sensation, perception, response, awareness. Our awareness is really of our sensations, perceptions, and our responses. So the awareness is separate, but it contains the first three, but then it points to what comes after it, which is belief. So our awareness becomes consolidated into beliefs, and then belief, faith, behavior, belonging. Beliefs become faith, and then faith affects our behaviors, and then our behaviors cause us to belong. And there's the belonging, the longing to be, right? So then belonging is separate, but it contains the first three, and then it points to what comes after it, which is thinking. So we're longing to be when you're in a group. So like I said, the first quadrant is instinctual, sensation, perception, response, awareness, and then the second quadrant is magical group. So in the first quadrant, you're not an individual yet. You're just an instinctual entity. And then once you have this awareness, then you can start to belong. You have belief, faith, behavior, belonging. Then once you belong, that's a magical, groupish, religious quadrant. Belief, faith, behavior, belonging. Once you belong, then you can become an individual. And then you move into the third quadrant, which is rational, interpersonal, thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. So you belong, and then you long to be. You long to be an individual, which is thinking, emotion, doing, dreaming. That's when you break out of the group and you start to think. And then dreaming is separate, but it contains the first three. When you dream, you have thoughts, emotions, and do. But then it points to what comes after it, which is contemplation, passion. Because when you dream, you transcend the body, which is pointing you to contemplation, passion, flowing, knowing, which is a transpersonal, transrational consciousness. So that was my revelation. And I started seeing this pattern, this 4x4 matrix, this 4-quadrant pattern everywhere in existence. So I'll get to that.